And we've heard both sides of this issue today. Our next guest is Scott Handy, president of the Cass County Electric, and was part of the panel today. Scott, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Scott. Glad to be here.
You've done something very novel in the middle of this debate. You've actually taken the time to read the measure itself, to read the Legislative Council's study on this, to read the Beacon Hill study on this, which in the case of the Legislative Council, it's an objective study that says, hey, we're against this and here's what would happen and why. In the case of the Empower the Taxpayer Group, they're touting the Beacon Hill Institute study as a reason to eliminate property taxes in North Dakota, and of course the measure itself. So if you would kind of walk us through what you've done, and I would also encourage other people to do the same, because in the middle of these debates, sometimes your eyes roll in the back of your head trying to follow everything that everybody's saying, but reading these things are important, aren't they?
Sure, and early on in the debate, the proponents of Measure 2 have always asked the question when someone starts to debate on this is, have you read the measure? Well, I kind of took that as a signal. My board several months ago authorized us to take a stand against this, so I thought I'm going to be asked to say something publicly at some point, so I'm kind of a policy wonk. I read the measure. I read the Legislative Council report. I read the Beacon Hill study because I wanted to really understand here. So when we're challenged about this and a question comes up, have you read the measure? Well, I have, and we all need to do that because the measure language is notable for what it says. It's more notable for what it doesn't say. It's a very brief document, and it just leaves the door wide open, in my opinion, for lots of unintended things to happen.
One of the things that the folks from the Empower the Taxpayer Group take exception with is the fact that the brochure misquotes the issue of demanding that the legislature fully and properly fund all legally imposed obligations of state government, saying rather we're leaving it to political subdivisions. They're saying it isn't the state that would decide, it's rather the political subdivisions. A, address that point, and B, tell me about some of your biggest red flags in the actual measure.
Well, again, let's go back and take a look at the document. The Legislative Assembly is the one that is charged with coming up with a formula for this, and the most often quoted part of that sentence is to fully and properly fund, and that's in there. But you need to read the next words that follow that, and that is the legally imposed obligations. Mr. Hale directed us to some sections of the Constitution and some sections of state statute that he says define that, but in my opinion, as a non-attorney, I think the legally imposed obligations is a pretty wide opening for interpretation by the legislature.
But then who decides? Is it the state legislature? Because their point is that it goes on to say not state government, but goes on to say political subdivisions. In other words, there would be local decision making on each of the what is fully and properly funding and what is a legally imposed obligation.
You kind of have to break this down into two pieces, and both your statements are true. The legislature is charged with fully and properly funding what it considers to be the legally imposed obligations. That part is true. However, once they send that money to the local political subdivisions, the measure language does state that how that money gets spent once it's in the hands is in the hands of the local political subdivision. So so the state decides, and then once they set the bar, then the locals basically here's your allowance, deal with it. My read on this is that the state decides how big the pie is. Local people still get to decide how to slice up the pie, but the more important part of that fundamental piece is how big is the pie going to be.
Right, and that's the danger. What's the biggest flag you see in the actual reading of the measure itself?
I just think, and again, speaking as a non-attorney, I think the language is broad enough where it can be interpreted a number of different ways, and the interpretation is largely done by the legislature.
The Beacon Hill study is something that the proponents use. You've used that, and obviously this is on their website. You used a term, weasel phrases.
Yeah.
What do you find in the way of weasel phrases in the Beacon Hill statement?
Well, I downloaded this thing and I read it with a highlighter, and I wanted to be objective about reading it, but when you start looking into it, you come across terms like not necessarily, assume, may lead to, estimated, conceptually, might suggest, could be made up, believed to be. I call those weasel phrases because they allow you room to weasel out or to to wiggle out of.
Well, it's uncertainty. I think it's fair to say it's uncertainty. I mean, there, when you're seeing could be's and maybes, and not necessarily that the outcome is unknown.
Right. And that's why businesses in particular struggle a lot with this, because businesses would rather deal with bad news than uncertainty. Uncertainty is a business killer. Bad news isn't a business killer because we can deal with that, but uncertainty is.
Nobody knows that more than the business you're in providing electricity to customers right now. There's a great deal of uncertainty with all the legislation and regulation that's floating out there. And speaking of that, specifically your board, the Cass County Electric Cooperative, has come out in opposition to this. You're treated unfairly, in your view, under this system if Measure 2 were to pass versus investor-owned, right?
That's our view, and again, this is set out again in the Legislative Council study that the in lieu property tax method that the electric cooperatives are taxed under would stay intact. And in our case, just at Cass County Electric, that's just a little bit north of $1 million a year. The investor-owned utilities who are taxed on the more traditional ad valorem method, their property taxes would go away. In our read on things, we already pay a little bit more per kilowatt hour of property taxes, and if this goes into effect and the investor-owned property taxes go away and ours stay as they are now, that just makes that situation even worse.
And obviously that means your ratepayers pay more. I mean, the money has to come from somewhere.
Well, yeah, I don't think they would pay more. It's just that they wouldn't have the opportunity to pay less like the investor-owned customers would.
Yeah, interesting. All right, only about 45 seconds left. Any closing thoughts on you mentioned the Legislative Council study on this as well, just your overall view on this?
Oh, again, like I said in our closing statements at the panel, take the advice of the Measure 2 proponents. Read the documents and conclude for yourselves what they say. Read the measure language, especially read the Legislative Council report, which is also available on the legislative website. And if you're inclined, go ahead and read the Beacon Hill Institute study and draw your own conclusions. In my mind, I think you'll be drawn to the conclusion that my organization has reached, and that is that this thing should be defeated.
Do you feel in a disadvantage in that you're having to argue against reforming property taxes?
Well, sure. Like my fellow panelist Brad Schlossman said, I want to be on the side of this thing. I'm one of those weirdos that doesn't have my property taxes escrowed. I go to the courthouse every December 31st and I handwrite a check for that, so I know what I'm paying, and the number is a big number. But I think there's better ways of dealing with this than abolishing it altogether and shifting the decision-making out to the legislature instead of locally. One
of the challenges that came from Ed Schaefer is to say, you know what, let's not let this be the end. Let's be the beginning of reform and discussion, and certainly the debate has been great.
I agree.
Yeah. Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Scott Handy with his take, President of Cass County Electric, on the Measure 2 debate. When we come back, we're going to talk with a Cass County Commissioner, Scott Wagner, one of those individuals that would like to retain the local control that opponents of Measure 2 say would be lost under Measure 2. And then we'll talk with the forum sponsor today, Craig Whitney, President of the Fargo-Moorhead West Fargo Chamber, on the impact of the debate and discussion for today.